Warm greetings. Welcome to Heart Stories. May you find yourself and healing through the stories we share. Now, let the journey begin.
Some flights carry more than passengers. They carry proof that the world can be cruel, but also that it can change. And sometimes, the change starts with two teenage boys walking down the first-class aisle, heads high, hearts quietly trembling beneath polished shoes. Evan and Eli were not ordinary passengers. They didn't dress like businessmen. They didn't look like old money. But they walked as if they belonged because they did. Matching suitcases in hand, shirts neatly tucked, eyes alert, eyeliner barely smudged from nervous hands. They were 16, white, identical twins, both openly gay, both unafraid of who they were, and they had every reason to be proud. Only a few weeks earlier, they had stunned the tech world by winning a national invention competition. Their prototype, an artificial intelligence system designed to detect and defuse terror threats before planes even took off. A system that could save thousands of lives. It had drawn praise from professors, cybersecurity experts, and even federal agencies. But none of that brilliance had come easy. Before they were prodigies. Evan and Eli were statistics, unwanted, abandoned in a state-run orphanage with peeling walls and broken clocks. Until one day, everything changed. Dr. Grace Ashford, CEO of one of the most powerful security firms in aviation, had walked in and seen not orphans, but promise. She adopted them when they were just 7. Not because she needed children, but because, as she often said, every mind matters, especially the ones the world throws away. She raised them in a home of rigorous honesty and unflinching support, where integrity mattered more than appearances, and knowledge was treated like a language of survival. Under her roof, they didn't just grow, they became. Evan was the quieter one, analytical, with eyes that noticed patterns before people spoke. Eli, sharper around the edges, wore his identity like armor, even when it got him bruised. But together, they were unstoppable. They coded late into the night. They read patents instead of bedtime stories. And when Grace saw their sketches for a predictive AI scanner built for airport networks, she didn't just encourage them, she funded their first prototype. So when an international security conference in San Francisco invited them to present their technology, Grace surprised them with something else, 2 VIP first-class seats. It was her way of saying, "You've earned your place in the world. Now go take it." The morning of the flight, they dressed in fitted black slacks and soft dress shirts, subtle but sharp. Eli wore a pride pin on his lapel because hiding was never an option. Evan, nervous as always, checked their boarding passes at least 4 times. Grace smiled as she handed them their tickets and whispered, "Don't let the altitude shrink you. Remember who you are?" At the airport, everything felt surreal. Security waved them through with curiosity, not suspicion. Other passengers noticed them, 2 teenage boys who looked too young for first class but walked with quiet purpose. When they reached the gate, they saw their names light up on the monitor. It felt like being seen, finally, not just by Grace, but by the world. But the moment they stepped onto the aircraft, the air shifted. A woman in a pearl-white pantsuit stood near the first-class cabin, eyeing them with a cold kind of curiosity. Madeline Kingsley, finance mogul, frequent flyer, a name that made headlines, and not always for the right reasons. Her smile didn't reach her eyes as she watched the boys approach. No words were exchanged yet, just glances and judgment. Still, Evan and Eli took their seats, politely, quietly, trying not to make a ripple in waters that already felt cold. They didn't know her name. They didn't know her influence. But something in her stare told them she had decided who they were. And it wasn't innovators. It wasn't talented. It was something far smaller. They didn't know yet how far that gaze would go, or how powerful silence could become when backed by the right truth. What they did know, what they clung to, was this: they were not going back. Not to that orphanage, not to being invisible, not to shame. This wasn't just a trip. This was a message, and no turbulence. Not even the kind born of prejudice. It was going to knock them from their course. Because when a child is given love, recognition, and the freedom to dream, it's not just their life that changes. It's the sky they rise into. If this story touched you, share it. and follow Heart Story, where real voices rise and real hearts listen. The hum of the aircraft softened as Evan and Eli stepped into the first-class cabin. Plush seats, warm lighting, the soft scent of leather and citrus. It should have felt like the reward it was. But instead, something tightened in Eli's chest. A flight attendant in a crisp uniform stood at the entrance, scanning their tickets with a pause, just a little too long. Her name tag read Jocelyn. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "These are your seats?" she asked, though the answer was printed clearly in her hand. Evan nodded, calmly, offering their IDs and boarding passes. Jocelyn scanned them again, then glanced at the back of the cabin, where Madeline Kingsley sat with one leg crossed over the other, watching like a judge from a private courtroom. Jocelyn gave a polite, tight smile. "Would you boys mind?" Considering a move to business class just to make things more comfortable for the other guests. The request didn't sound hostile, not exactly, but it wasn't a question either. And it wasn't about comfort. Eli blinked hard, a pressure building behind his eyes. His mind, uninvited, pulled him back to the day he was separated from Evan at the orphanage when a caseworker said, "This one's being transferred." No warning, no goodbye. Just taken. That same feeling crept in now. The quiet message, "You don't belong here." He gripped the seat arm, knuckles whitening, beside him. Evan remained steady. His voice didn't shake. He looked at Jocelyn with the same clarity he used when debugging algorithms. "These are our seats," he said. His tone was polite but firm, measured. He didn't raise his voice or break eye contact. He simply stated the truth. Jocelyn hesitated. Madeline Kingsley, seated nearby with her tablet in hand, didn't hesitate at all. She leaned forward slightly, speaking just loud enough for others to hear. "First class used to be for professionals," she said. "Now it's a daycare for confused little boys in makeup." A quiet laugh escaped someone from the row behind. Eli stiffened. Evan's fingers found his again. A quiet signal. "You're not alone." The surrounding passengers said nothing. Jocelyn cleared her throat. "It's not about the seats, boys. It's about keeping things calm." But the twins weren't causing a scene. They hadn't raised their voices. They hadn't done anything wrong except exist in a space where people like them were not expected or accepted. They took their seats anyway. Silent, dignified. As the plane continued boarding, Eli stared at the safety card in the seat pocket, barely breathing. He wasn't afraid of flying. He was afraid of being erased. Again. He had survived worse. So had Evan. But there was a unique kind of pain in being treated like an intruder in a space you were explicitly invited into. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a message one wrapped in civility and delivered with a smile. Evan sat upright beside him, still holding Eli's hand. He scanned the cabin the way he might scan code, searching for signs of logic where there was only bias. He understood now that no amount of genius could shield them from this. They had done everything right, and still, they were being asked to apologize for being who they were. Eli whispered something barely audible. Evan didn't ask what. He just squeezed his hand again. In the sterile calm of first class, surrounded by champagne flutes and polished shoes, two boys sat upright and defiant, small in body, but immense in purpose. The aircraft hadn't taken off yet, but turbulence had already begun. What no one around them realized was that this moment, this single moment of quiet resistance, was just as powerful as any algorithm they'd ever written. Because the real test wasn't in the lab, it was here, in the cabin. It wasn't about defending their invention. It was about defending their right to exist in the same space as those who wish they'd disappear. Some wounds don't bleed, they echo, especially for those who've lived through abandonment, ridicule, and invisibility. The pain of microaggressions doesn't come from their volume, it comes from their familiarity. And yet, dignity persisted. For Evan and Eli, dignity had always been their first line of defense. A kind of armor built not from defiance, but from survival. And survival, when carried with grace, becomes power. The plane had barely finished boarding when the pressure around the twins began to shift again, not physically, but in the atmosphere. It started with murmurs, then a shadow, then footsteps. Madeline Kingsley had not moved from her seat, but her influence had. Jocelyn, the flight attendant, returned, this time accompanied by the cabin service manager, a tall man with a professional smile that didn't quite hide his discomfort. "Good afternoon," he began, voice low, courteous. "We've had a few concerns regarding seating. Some guests feel unsettled. We're asking if you'd be willing to relocate to business class for everyone's comfort." It wasn't a request. Not really. Evan stood, slow and composed. He reached into his side pocket and pulled out the documentation. 2 first-class boarding passes, their government-issued IDs, and a small ivory card embossed in metallic silver, the professional business card of Dr. Grace Ashford, CEO of Ashford Secure Cloud AI. "These are our tickets," he said. "Our seats were purchased by Dr. Ashford." He didn't need to say more. The implication was clear, but it wasn't enough. The manager shifted his weight, eyes flicking briefly toward Madeline Kingsley, who now seemed to be half watching, half listening, with the detached ease of someone used to shaping outcomes from afar. From across the aisle, a woman's voice rang out firm, clear, and unimpressed. "I've flown first class for decades," she said. "This is blatant discrimination." The speaker was elderly, but her tone carried the sharpness of a well-used blade. She wore a navy blouse with gold buttons and a confidence that came from years of speaking her mind. Her name, Evan would learn later, was Mrs. Hale. She didn't rise from her seat. She didn't argue. She simply looked at the staff and then at the boys and said what should have been obvious. "They belong here." For a brief second, silence hung in the air. Heavy, uncomfortable. But again, it wasn't enough. The manager's smile faltered. He turned back to Evan and Eli. "If you choose not to cooperate, we'll be forced to involve airport security when we land. I hope we don't have to escalate the situation." Eli, seated and frozen, stared at the carpet. Escalate. Like they were the threat, like presence alone could be provocation. Evan stayed standing. He didn't raise his voice. His hands were steady. He held the business card out again. The manager didn't take it. Behind him, Jocelyn shifted uncomfortably. Someone in row 2 coughed, clearly wanting the disruption to end. Not because it was wrong, but because it was inconvenient. That's the part that always stung the most. Not when people screamed at you, but when they stayed silent. When they watched discomfort happen and chose to fold their hands. Eli didn't speak. His throat was tight. He was back in that moment at 7 years old, standing alone in a hallway while a foster parent said, "He's too much work." He had thought he'd escaped that voice, but it was here again, polished, pressed, wearing a name badge. Still, Evan didn't move. He looked at Mrs. Hale. She nodded once barely, but it was enough. The plane was still parked at the gate, but the battle had already landed. This wasn't about seats anymore. It was about boundaries, and whether people like Evan and Eli were allowed to take up space without apology. As the minutes stretched on, the tension thickened. The airline staff didn't yell, they didn't curse, but every gesture, every delay, every glance toward the problem passenger said what words wouldn't. "You're making us uncomfortable. Please shrink." But Evan didn't shrink. He held the weight of his brother's silence, the fear behind Eli's careful posture, the history they both carried on their shoulders. And he turned that weight into stillness, into clarity, into refusal. Across the aisle, Mrs. Hale pulled out her phone. Her eyes flicked to Jocelyn. "I suggest you let them stay," she said, "because if this becomes public, it won't reflect well on your airline." It was the first time someone had threatened consequences that didn't fall on the boys. That small shift, the possibility of accountability, hung like static in the air. No one moved. Not yet. But the temperature had changed. Sometimes confrontation doesn't come with shouting. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the decision to remain seated when others want you to disappear, in the courage to present your truth again and again, even when it's dismissed. And sometimes, the most powerful ally is not the loudest, but the one who doesn't look away. Prejudice often comes in the softest forms, not fists, not slurs, but policies wrapped in politeness. And it takes emotional maturity, especially in young people, to recognize that silence in the face of bias is not neutrality, it's participation. In that pressurized cabin, where everything looked calm on the surface, a storm was brewing, not outside, Inside, and the boys, they were no longer afraid of weather. They had already lived through the worst of it. Just as the tension began to calcify in the stale cabin air, a new presence entered the aircraft, one that didn't need to raise her voice to shift every eye and breath in the room. Doctor. Grace Ashford stepped into the aisle with a calmness that felt both practiced and earned. She was not flustered. She was not late. She was arriving precisely when she meant to, as if some part of her had known her sons might need her not to rescue, but to witness. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't scold the staff. She walked down the narrow aisle with the quiet assurance of a woman who had spent her life building systems the world depended on, but rarely credited. When she reached Evan and Eli, she placed one hand gently on each of their shoulders. She didn't speak to them. She didn't need to. Her touch was enough to steady Eli, who had stopped breathing normally 20 minutes ago. Then she turned to the cabin manager, still standing uncertainly near the front. Without fanfare, Grace reached into her leather handbag and withdrew a card. No explanations, no outrage, just a single movement of her hand, as effortless as it was definitive. The card read, Dr. Grace Ashford, founder and CEO, Ashford Secure Cloud AI Engineering Safety for the Skies. She let it hang in the air between them like a quiet truth. The manager's eyes flicked down to the words, then up again. Confused, then alarmed. From her seat, Madeline Kingsley leaned forward slightly. Interest peaked. Grace said only one sentence. The technology that keeps this aircraft safe from digital threats, she said softly, was developed by the two young men you've spent the last half hour humiliating. And just like that, the silence turned brittle. Someone a few rows behind them reached for their phone. Someone else began whispering. A younger man seated across the aisle typed into his search bar and pulled up a recent cover of Wired magazine. There they were, the Ashford twins' Gen Z minds reimagining airspace safety. Headline bold, faces confident. The man tilted his screen toward the passenger next to him. Then someone else leaned in. The photo circulated faster than Turbulence. Whispers turned to clicks. Clicks turned to stares. They're the Ashford twins, someone finally said aloud. They invented the AI surveillance network that got licensed by the FAA last quarter. Now it was no longer about seats. It wasn't even about identity. It was about power, about how easily people assign value or strip it away based on appearance, age, or who they choose to love. Jocelyn, the flight attendant, paled. The cabin manager took a step back. And Madeline Kingsley. She said nothing. She sat straighter, her jaw clenched. But she didn't speak. What could she say now? That she hadn't known, that her assumptions had blinded her to the fact that the boys she belittled weren't just passengers. They were the reason she was flying safely at all. There was no apology. Not then. Not yet. But the damage had already spilled beyond the cabin. By the time the plane touched down in San Francisco, a blurry video had already reached Twitter, TikTok, and LinkedIn. A teenage girl from row 4 had recorded most of the exchange, Eli trembling, Evan holding firm, Grace handing over her card. No screaming, no dramatics, just a story of quiet, devastating discrimination. And the receipts to prove it. Public backlash came swiftly. The airline issued a formal apology within 12 hours. An internal investigation was announced. Jocelyn was placed on administrative leave. The cabin manager was reassigned. And as for Madeline Kingsley, she was scheduled to finalize a major investment deal with a rival airline the following week. After the footage went viral, the airline declined the partnership, citing conflicts of value alignment. Her firm's stock dipped. For the first time in years, her name wasn't trending for her business acumen. It was trending because she had underestimated two boys in eyeliner, and the world noticed. Evan and Eli didn't ask for any of it. They didn't post the video. They didn't speak publicly. They returned to their hotel, answered a few cautious questions from the press, and went to sleep early, exhausted, not by exposure, but by the weight of enduring what too many others endure in silence. What the world saw as a viral moment was, to them, just another day of proving their right to exist. Grace never gloated. She simply sat with her sons that night, tucked her phone away, and said, "Next time you fly, no one will question your seat." And Eli, still quiet, finally whispered back, "But someone else's will be." It was then that Evan realized the real win wasn't vindication. It was the shift, however small, in how the world saw boys like them, not as burdens, not as misfits, but as necessary, as brilliant, as belonging. Sometimes, the most powerful technology doesn't live in the code. It lives in the people who refuse to let the system stay broken. The conference hall in San Francisco was packed with educators, engineers, journalists, and cybersecurity officials from across the country. But all eyes were drawn to the smallest figures on stage. Evan and Eli stood under the spotlight, not in matching outfits, not in choreographed synchronization, but as individuals who had grown into their voices. Their presentation on Ashford Secure Cloud's latest updates was clear, polished, and unshaken by the media storm that had unfolded days before. But it was the last line that silenced the room. "Security," Evan said, voice steady, "should protect everyone," Eli added. "But dignity is the first layer of defense." The audience rose, not in polite obligation, but in recognition, not just for the technology, not just for their youth, but for their integrity. That single moment, the final slide still glowing behind them. The applause rising wasn't about redemption. It was about reclamation. They had taken back the narrative. In the days that followed, the story continued to ripple, not just through tech circles, but across classrooms, dinner tables, boardrooms. A handwritten letter arrived at the Ashford household 2 weeks later. It was from Mrs. Hale. She had been quiet since the flight, but her words now were precise. "My grandson was like your boys," she wrote. "Kind, soft-spoken, brilliant. He didn't survive the cruelty." But watching Evan and Eli refuse to disappear, it reminded me of what I wish he had seen before it was too late. Grace folded the letter carefully, placing it inside a drawer in her office, not as a trophy, but as a responsibility. It was that letter that sparked an idea. Months later, the Ashford Foundation for LGBT Tech Youth was born, quietly at first, then with momentum, scholarships, mentorship programs, community coding workshops for queer teens in foster care and underfunded schools. Not just opportunities, but safe entry points into a world where intelligence was too often gatekept by prejudice. Evan and Eli never saw themselves as pioneers, but they became symbols subtly, quietly, like most changemakers do. Not because they chased the spotlight, but because they walked through it without flinching. Their story was picked up in school curriculum pilot programs focused on resilience, equity, and ethics in STEM. It was retold not as a scandal, but as a case study in courage. One morning, while reviewing submissions for the Foundation's first youth grant, Eli paused over an essay written by a boy named Riley from Minnesota. The last line of the application read, "I used to think someone like me could never belong in tech. But if Evan and Eli built something that keeps airplanes safe, maybe I can build something that keeps kids like me safe too." That sentence stuck with them, because what started as a seat assignment had become a blueprint. A new kind of legacy measured not in headlines or algorithms, but in the quiet shift of what a young person believed was possible. And in a world that often rewards the loudest voices, sometimes the most lasting change begins with two boys who refused to give up their seats. Their invention protected the skies, but their story protected something even more fragile: hope. Now let us ask you, when was the last time you saw someone judged before they even had a chance to speak? Share your thoughts in the comments, because stories like this one deserve to start conversations. Follow Heart Story for more true, powerful narratives that bring voices to the front and help hearts find their way home.